Chapter 54. Gunny held his breath. He didn't have to ask Wint or Murdoch if they were doing the same. Hell, Murdoch had probably already shit his suit. Gunny wouldn't blame him if he had. They were 250 meters away from the SV-52 and a full click away from Mira itself. For regular munitions detonations, that was more than adequate. If a ship dropped a nuke, however, that was a completely different set of problems. Neither the SFMC nor the SFN were in the habit of dropping that kind of ordnance if their Marines could be caught in the blast, so it wasn't a concern he normally had to have. This was different. When the normal ordnance went off, you knew the damage potential. You knew damned well how many hull plates might turn into debris fields, whether or not there might be radiation leaks, and the size of the shockwave. With this, who the hell knew? Certainly not the goddamned AIs, let alone the idiot humans floating hundreds of meters from where the missile was going. Talby announced he was firing. Gunny clutched the controls in a death grip, his flesh pinched inside his form-fitting gloves. "Here we go, Marines," he said. The squad comms, just like the general comms, had gone deathly silent. From the SV-52's belly, a cylindrical object popped out of its tube, flying through space at a lazy speed of a few meters per second. As soon as it reached 10 meters from the craft, its rocket engine came to life. Gunny watched in utter silence as the missile streaked toward Mira. "Get ready," he said to his squad. The two Marines didn't reply, but he could feel the tension as if Murdoch and Wint were sitting next to him, without suits and without the void of space surrounding them. This was either going to be a miracle for them or turn life into one hell of a nightmare. In the seconds it took for the munition to eat the distance between the SV-52 and Mira, Gunny realized there was the third possibility. They could all just die. He grunted at the thought just as the missile found its target. The cam feed pointed at Mira stuttered with static when a bright flash erupted inside the Derelict's broken aft section. Gunny's screens dampened the near solar-strength flash of light, keeping him from being blinded, but the rest of what he saw was through the haze of a spherical afterimage. Mira's aft section glowed for an instant before it once again fell into shadows. Some kind of debris cloud formed inside the broken and shattered remnants of the giant ship's aft section. Then, nothing.
"So that's it?"
Wint said over the comms. Gunny held his breath, his eyes still trying to recover from the afterimage. He waited another moment before exhaling with a grin on his face. "I guess so," he said, just as a radiation alert popped up in red on his HUD. "Oh shit," he said. A second later, their suits were bombarded with the energy from extreme radioactive decay. The wave of particles passed in an eye blink, and the rad warning disappeared. "Check your suits," he growled into the mic. His own HUD told him his suit had blocked a very lethal wave of radiation. Both Wint and Murdoch had weathered the storm as well. "Holy shit," he thought. "We're alive."
"Done to Gunny."
"Aye, sir," the captain sighed.
"Good to hear you're still there."
"Copy that, sir," he said. Dunn cleared his throat.
"Dalby, what's the damage?"
A new feed appeared on his HUD. Gunny added the stream and brought it up on the main window, barely registering that the images were from Copenhagen's cannon cam. Unlike the skiff's cannon, the SV-52's cannon had been designed for reconnaissance as well as targeting hostiles from a long distance. The cannon's feed detail was much better than anything Gunny could hope for from the skiff's cams, but he almost wished the detail was less clear. The inside of Mira looked more like a yawning mouth now. The warhead had done little structural damage, or so it appeared, but the nests of pulsing lights had gone dark, as though they'd never existed. There wasn't enough light now to see inside the aft section. Without the glow the creatures had provided, even the blue filters couldn't penetrate the deepest shadows. Gunny checked the location of the beacon. It was now clothed in complete and total darkness.
"Well,"
Talby said.
"that was interesting."
He paused for a beat.
"Gunny?"
He gulped and tried to staunch the flittering butterflies in his stomach. "Ready, sir."
"Get going."
"Aye, sir." He switched to the squad comms. "We're moving out, Marines." He opened the throttle and the rear thrusters came to life. The skiff was on the move. Talby watched the skiff pass beneath the SV-52 and continued accelerating. Wint had the skiff's cannon pointed at Mira's aft, while Murdoch, at the skiff's rear, held his rifle and scanned the space around them for targets. Gunny and his 2 Marines were heading into the maelstrom. Telby said a silent prayer to the void they'd grab the damn thing and get out of there without losing anyone, but he knew the chances of that were damn small.
Sir?
Copenhaver asked. Yes, Private?
That object hasn't slowed. It's coming straight at us.
Cursing, he flipped to Copenhaver's cam feed. She had swiveled the turret and cam so it faced the incoming KBO. No more than 30 seconds had passed between their first proximity warning and the missile firing, but it was already enough for him to make out certain details. The object's surface not only shimmered, but writhed with activity. It was still too far away to make out exactly what was shaking and pulsing, but something alive or mechanical, actually several hundred somethings, covered the object. Or maybe they were the object in totality. A shiver ran down his spine. Could that be a nest similar to the ones they'd seen inside Mira? Or was it something worse? Talby to Dunn, over,
Go ahead.
the captain said. We have a bead on the incoming bogey, sir,
So do we.
Dunn said.
Black is ready to fire a CO2 cloud. We're going to wait until it's a little closer.
Copy, sir. He flipped from the cam feed to that of the skiff. The kilometer of space between Mira and the craft had all but disappeared. The skiff, traveling at 15 meters per second, had nearly reached the damaged superstructure. They were heading inside. In another few seconds, he wouldn't be able to see anything of the skiff apart from its powerful floodlights stabbing through the darkness. Get in and get out, Gunny, Talby said to no one. Darkness closed over them like a death shroud. Gunny had kicked on the floods when they were less than 50 meters away from Mira's lightless interior, but the lights might as well have been as powerful as matches. Instead of shining off the remaining Atmos steel deck plates, bulkheads, and hanging debris, the light just seemed to disappear 10 or so meters away from the skiff. He planned on cutting the skiff's speed to 5 meters per second, but without more visibility, that was much too fast. By the time he'd seen an obstacle, the skiff would hit it a second later. He fired the 4 thrusters, and the skiff slowed to 2 meters per second. It was still too fast, but if they had any chance of reaching the beacon before the first of the KBOs attacked, LaFloods illuminated a hanging, damaged support beam that looked like a crooked, deteriorated tooth. Gunny managed to hit the attitude thrusters in time to push the skiff to starboard before they rammed right into it. He heard Went exhale harshly through the comms and did his best not to do the same. The light continued to weaken as if the floods were losing power, yet his HUD showed no power loss at all. Something's eating the light, he thought. That's insane. Yet he knew that's exactly what was happening. He continued maneuvering the skiff through clouds of crumbled Atmos steel and twisted supports. Flakes of tortured metal and perhaps shattered exosolar lifeform carapaces pinged off his helmet and visor. Some of the debris tugged at his form-fitting combat suit, scraping against the Atmos steel weave and threatening to stick. Gunny barely noticed. The seconds ticked down in his head like a counter, each of his heartbeats marking another second toward being attacked by Void knew how many hostiles, and the beacon was still 30 meters away. The floods dimmed again. Now he could barely see more than 5 meters in front of him. Went, he growled. Keep using that cannon cam. You see anything before I do, scream out before you fire.
Aye, Gunny.
Went said.
But I can't see shit.
I can't either.
Murdoch whispered. Gunny said nothing. He slowed the skiff again and barely had time to dodge another support beam. Then his eyes went wide. The nests had been made of some kind of metal or biological material that looked like metal. Just as with the creature's shells and limbs, the substance looked jet black except for the occasional ridge or other defect. But many of the support beams had dark crusts and thick tendrils wrapping around the Atmos steel. To Gunny, the tissue looked suspiciously like human afterbirth if it had been spray-painted black and made of metal. He shivered at the mental image of an alien womb spreading the substance like mucus over the supports to hold its eggs or spawn. 20 meters to the beacon. The rising rad meter gauge on the HUD didn't exactly calm him. The levels were still far below lethal, and the suit shielding had so far handled the barrage of radiation, but he didn't know how much longer that would last. Every meter forward meant another notch on the gauge. By the time they reached the beacon, he figured the gauge would be little more than a point or two from the red. Once it swung into that area, they'd have less than 2 minutes before their suit shields failed. And after that, Well, he and his squad wouldn't need lights. They'd glow in the fucking dark. Beneath the wash of crackles and spits that spilled through the comms, he heard a voice that might have been Dunn's, but it was impossible to understand. Every syllable or two, static flooded over the voice like a tsunami. The light from the floods dwindled, the powerful lamp's illumination barely more than a glow in the darkness. Gunny's skin crawled as he slowed to less than 1 meter per second. He could hardly see anything, and to make matters worse, the clock ticking in his head had counted down to 0. They were out of time, and hadn't yet reached the beacon. Another careful port thrust, and the skiff floated past broken support beams. The rad counter went up again, his HUD flashing with radiation warnings. Something near the back of the aft section flashed, briefly bathing the area in harsh white light. Before the afterimage completely blinded him, he saw it. The beacon. He brought the skiff to a full stop, although he was unable to see his hands in front of him. The suit's screens had stopped the worst of the flash, a burst so high it should have permanently blinded him, but it still left a ghostly reflection on his retinas. He reflexively tried to blink it away, but it stayed with him, and while it did, they were at a complete standstill.
Gunny?
Wynn said nervously. Yeah, I need a second here, he said. The beacon. A few scant meters away. So close, even the wan light illuminated the clutter of etchings and scratches along the cylinder. The device could flash fry them if it decided to go off again at full power. The damn thing had attracted these crazy life forms from Void only knew where, but it was a bona fide alien artifact. Scientists would pore over it for decades, if not centuries, trying to determine if the markings indicated language, and if so, what the scratches and etches meant. He had no doubt it would have its own museum on Earth and be patronized by the wealthiest in Sol. He smirked. It wasn't going to Earth or anywhere else in Sol system, let alone a museum. No one would study it. No one would try and unlock the secrets of its power source or who had made it. Instead, they were going to send it straight to hell. His eyes fully cleared and he rotated the skiff, mindful of the 2 twisted support beams hanging less than a meter from the top of the cannon placement. If he ran into those, he could damage the cannon or even decapitate Went. As he swung the skiff, he said, Murdoch, you're our retriever. There was a long pause before the Marine answered.
Aye, Gunny.
Tether yourself and get out there. I want that thing in the skiff as fast as you can make it happen.
Aye.
The private said again. Gunny flipped his attention to the rear cam and couldn't help but grin. Murdoch had appeared, his rifle maglocked to his back, like a professional soldier. The Marine tentatively activated his suit thrusters, just enough to nudge him toward the beacon. Gunny held his breath as the young Marine approached the cylindrical object. Murdoch reached the scarred and blackened platform where the beacon sat, its cradle of plasteel weathered and pitted as if from thousands of micro-impacts. Went's suit cam showed him all the detail he needed to see. The images Calimura's squad had sent from Mira didn't do the thing justice. In the near-absolute darkness of the broken aft section, the cylinder seemed to glow beneath Murdoch's suit lights. Worse, the glow seemed to be getting brighter. Hurry the fuck up, he whispered to no one. Murdoch stepped onto the platform, his foot maglocking him to the Atmos steel surface. He carefully pulled his other foot forward and locked it as well. He stood there for a moment before leaning toward the device. Through the suit cam, Gunny saw the holdup. The cradle in which the beacon sat was hardly intact after all. The front of the cradle seemed fine, but the sides had become a tangle of thick, melted plasteel.
Gunny?
Murdoch said.
How do I?
Use your knife, he said as calmly as he could, doing his best to ignore the screaming voice in his head, telling him to get the fuck out of here as fast as he could. Cut that shit away. Pull a torch if you have to. Murdoch paused for a moment before reaching into his pouch and pulling the vibro knife. He leaned in further and began cutting the material. It parted with some effort, Murdoch's arm visibly struggling to pull the Atmos steel blade through the congealed material.
Gunny.
Went's voice broke through the comms. What?
Forward cams. I think we have a problem.
Gunny flipped back to the skiff's forward cam. He blinked twice before his mouth opened in a large O of surprise. The KBO had arrived, and all hell had arrived with it. Talby had rotated the SV-52 to face the incoming threat, and Copenhaver kept the cannon pointed at Mira, ready to shoot anything that looked like it might try and enter the aft section. Or, Talby thought, if anything comes out of there apart from the skiff. With his eyes fixed on the incoming KBO, the other cam feeds forgotten, Talby could only stare in wonder as the thing closed the distance. Less than a kilometer now, and it was slowing.
Lieutenant,
Black said, instantly causing Talby to jump in his seat.
we are ready to fire.
Copy, Talby said. You're a go. Black counted down from 3. In the vacuum of space, there was no sound to hear as the missile left its launch tube, and no sound when its rockets kicked in. The only proof Talby had that anything had happened at all was the object that streaked by the SV-52 some 50 meters above. As it passed, its bright rocket engine plume caused his screens to dim the incoming light. The feed's strong filters made the plume a dark yellow and blue flare rather than a blinding white. The missile quickly accelerated before detonating in the KBO's proximity with a muted flash. A large cloud of gas appeared in space, the particles barely reflecting Sol's anemic light. That was when everything changed. The KBO seemed to explode, or maybe shatter was the right word. It came apart like a large sedimentary rock in a jet spray of water. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of creatures broke apart in an amorphous swarm of incongruous shapes. A second later, the rabble moved as one toward the cloud, their disparate trajectories suddenly converging. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. The creatures flew into the cloud and seemed to stop in its midst, but they hadn't really stopped. Instead, they were flying in circles, racing through and around the cloud like electrons orbiting an atom. The cloud, which should have dissipated after 20 seconds, was erased in the space of no more than 5 heartbeats. Not erased, Talby thought, consumed. He held his breath, waiting to see what they would do next. He didn't have to wait long. The creatures continued their bombing run through the remains of the cloud, assuredly plucking every last molecule of their unexpected meal. When they finished, the exosolar life forms began reassembling themselves in a misshapen sphere. "Oh shit," he said. "Copenhagen?
Aye, sir?
Get ready to swing that cannon,"
Copy, sir.
she said. He glanced at the cannon cam. She was still holding position on Mira, the cannon ready to rain tritium flechette rounds on any hostiles. "Talby to Dunn, over,"
Go ahead.
the captain said. "I don't think that slowed them down much, sir,"
Neither do I.
Dunn said.
Black?
We can fire another munition, Captain, but I doubt it will hold them any longer than the first.
"Great," Talby muttered.
Talby, if they come within range,
Dunn said.
give them something to think about, but you better keep a good ammo reserve. We have more incoming.
The creatures had finished assembling themselves, and once again they were moving toward Mira, their speed vastly diminished from their first approach. His HUD displayed their distance at 900 meters and quickly accelerating. Based on the rate, they would be within cannon range in a few seconds, and on top of the SV-52 roughly 10 seconds after that. No time at all, really. "God damn it, Gunny," he said. He nudged the 4 thrusters, and the SV-52 began gliding backward at 2 meters per second in Mira's direction. If those creatures were going to attack, he wanted to be sure he didn't crash into them with forward momentum. Not that it would matter much. If they were made of the same material as the starfish or the pine cones, the canopy would be obliterated in an instant, and shortly after that, the SV-52 would be little more than a debris cloud itself. They were coming, thousands of them, and more KBOs were on their way. We are fucked. The thoughts bounced inside his skull like flechette shards slamming into a hole. He realized his focus had been shattered and desperately tried to fight back the fear. It was Copenhagen's voice that finally managed to break through the swirling images of destruction.
Sir, what is that?
He shook himself and checked the cannon feed. For the second time in as many minutes, his mouth opened in surprise. But instead of wonder, a terrible river of ice roared through his veins. The very top of Mira's hull had darkened to near black, as if the giant hulk was being consumed. At first, he thought space itself had decided to devour Mira, all her secrets, all her exosolar hitchhikers. But gaps of Atmos steel appeared through the crawling wall of darkness. Pine cones, thousands of them, maybe hundreds of thousands, descended over the hull. The creatures floated from the top of the hull and headed to the damaged aft. "Void, help us," Talby said. "Copenhagen?
Aye, sir?
Give them something to think about,"
Copy.
she said. The 52 vibrated as the cannon came to life. The aft ate light. That much Gunny knew. He didn't know the physics behind it and didn't much give a shit. While the phenomenon was much worse near the beacon, the effect wasn't uniform. The bow cam feed caught enough Kuiper Belt light to see the edges of the destroyed infrastructure leading into space, but there was little space to be seen. Dozens of shapes flitted near the entrance. A few beats later, hundreds more appeared. Now it was more like thousands. "Damn it," Gunny whispered. He attempted a connection to Talby, but his HUD lit up with comm failures. Whatever was eating the light apparently swallowed the radio signals as well. This far inside Mira, it was impossible to communicate with either S&R Black or Talby. They were on their own. "Murdoch!" Gunny yelled. "Get that fucking thing inside the skiff! Now!" Murdoch didn't answer. Gunny flipped back to the aft feed. The Marine had finished cutting away the melted spots from one side and was working on the other. The beacon was glowing brighter. "Murdoch!" Gunny yelled again.
Working on it.
Murdoch muttered. With a terrific wrench, he pulled the melted plasteel clump away from the beacon. The glow ratcheted up. Murdoch maglocked his gloves to the beacon and pulled. The strange object grudgingly left its cradle, Murdoch leaning backward against its sudden release. He groaned before shutting down his magnetics. The momentum moved him off the platform and left him gliding back to the skiff, his charge in tow. "Secure that thing!" Gunny yelled. Murdoch freed one hand and pulled himself along using the tether. He only had 2 meters to travel between the platform and the skiff's gunnel, but it seemed to take forever. Gunny's heart rate rose as he watched with growing impatience. He switched back to the bow feed. The entrance they'd used had turned into a broken wall of darkness. "Went?"
Hi, Gunny. It's getting a lot worse.
"Well, get ready to clear a path," he said. "I get the feeling they're not going to let us out of here without a fight."
Copy.
Went said, his voice filled with determined but nervous resolve.
Aboard!
Murdoch yelled. He had 1 foot maglocked to the skiff and was still pulling the beacon over the gunnel. "Get it secured!" He was sure Murdoch muttered something under his breath, but Gunny wasn't going to yell at him for that. His own heart was doing gymnastics, and the urge to hit the throttle, to get the fuck out of here, was almost unstoppable. With every second that passed, the horde out there multiplied, thickening like a wall of moving tar. But worse than that was the palpable feeling of being inside this haunted derelict, the dread of doom crawling across his skin. Murdoch's other foot locked to the floor, and he had the beacon nearly inside the gunnel. Another second ticked by, his nerves jangling, his fingers tightening on the controls. The beacon slammed down into the hull as the storage area magnetics kicked on, the skiff vibrating and shuddering from the impact.
Clear!
Murdoch yelled. The private was already reaching for his rifle. "Marines, make a hole!" Gunny hit the thrusters while preparing for another obstacle course.
Holy shit!
Copenhaver yelled. He flipped to the cannon's cam feed. The creature that had slammed into the hull had slipped behind them, heading toward Mira. With the cannon zoomed in, the feed made the strange lifeform's image appear the size of Mira itself. Talby would have chuckled if not for the fact he was still reeling from shock. He had enough sense to switch back to the bow cam and spotted another sortie of the creatures. This group flew more spread apart and appeared to notice the SV-52 as well as S&R Black. Rather than heading straight at him or the larger ship, they skirted beneath, above, and around. He should have felt relief, no longer having to worry about a swarm of the things wrecking the SV-52, but their tactics meant they were smart, possibly as smart as the starfish, and much, much faster. 2 more flocks headed toward Mira. It was hopeless. He wasn't going to be able to stop shit from here. He rotated the SV-52, Copenhaver's cannon remaining fixed on the wall of pine cones attempting to swallow Mira's aft, and Gunny's exit. When he finished turning, a flash of light appeared near S&R Black. She had fired another of the trio's gifts, and a large group of pine cones evaporated into particles. The weapon had detonated on top of Mira's hull, but close enough to the aft to take out the port corner of the pine cone wall. The 52 vibrated as Copenhaver fired shot after shot directly into the pinecone horde. A flechette impacted with one of the new creatures and detonated. The insectile thing instantly transformed into a debris cloud of shattered arms, mandibles, and carapace. Talby grinned in spite of himself. At least the trio's ammo worked on those things, too. "Gunny," he said over the comms, "what's your ETA?" Nothing. Talby tried again, but the sergeant didn't answer. He flinched when the captain's voice broke over the comms a heartbeat later.
Talby,
Dunn said.
what's your ammo count?
He checked the counters on the right side of his HUD. 62 tritium and...
Cease fire and switch to regular rounds.
Aye, sir. Copenhagen? Talby said.
Doing it now, sir.
She said. The ammo counter had already dropped to 60 rounds before she switched. Cursing to himself, Talby refocused on the cannon feed. The explosive rounds, as expected, didn't appear to be damaging the pine cones. However, the barrage of lethal tritium rounds had apparently made them wary of the flying projectiles. The wall had begun to thin in patches as some of the pine cones decided to get out of range, or at least be less of a target. Talby glanced at the other cam feeds. S&R Black's starboard flechette cannons had started firing explosive rounds as well. The top of Mira's hull was alight with micro-explosions driving Atmos steel flechettes into the group still descending to the aft. A proximity alert warning flashed on the HUD. With a mental groan, he flipped to the starboard cam. What he saw made him blink. Just a few kilometers away, a trio of objects headed to the area. At least a dozen kilometers separated the three, and their trajectories weren't uniform, but they were coming. And if they were anything like the insect things, they'd arrive sooner than later. Talby to Dunn, do you?
We see them, Lieutenant.
Dunn said.
Stay as long as you can.
Aye, sir. Talby flipped back to the cannon feed. The pine cones had thinned their wall, but it was still at least a few creatures thick at its least crowded points. Through a few gaps, he could even see the blacker-than-black darkness inside the cut-off aft section, looking like the gaps between black teeth in a black mouth. Copenhagen was running out of explosive flechettes. During a typical Marine engagement, you didn't send 100 rounds into a crowd of suited humans without knowing they'd all be fragmented to hell. By the time you got 5 shots off, that particular battle was over, and portable anti-ship munitions were streaking toward you, or you managed to hurt them bad enough to force a retreat and move in for a search-and-destroy mission. But here, these damn things just soaked up the flechettes like Atmos steel sponges. Gunny! Talby tried again. Gunny, are you there? No response. Talby initiated a block connection to Gunny, but that didn't work either. Something inside the ship had completely scrambled their comms. Either that, or Gunny and his squad were already dead, floating inside the great derelict, meters from the beacon, trapped behind a wall of alien creatures. And we'd never know it, he said to himself.
Done to Talby.
The captain's voice broke through his thoughts. Aye, sir?
Another 30 seconds of this, and Black will be down to less than 50% of her munitions.
He knew what the captain was saying. He'd been thinking the same thoughts Talby had. Now it was time to cut bait. They'd failed for now. They'd have to find another way to...
Shit!
His speed bordered on suicidal, but there were gaps of light up ahead. He had a pretty good idea as to why, too. Right now, Private Copenhagen was no doubt spraying down the fucking things with flechette after flechette. And the pine cones? Well, they didn't like it one bit. Went and Murdoch fired their own weapons, tritium flechettes streaking through the darkness before plowing into the wall of creatures. The floodlights, seeming to get brighter the further they retreated toward the rear of the aft section, shined through clouds of shattered shells, decapitated silver hooks, and spinning gore. The skiff bumped a beam on the port side and the craft slid sideways as it approached the wall. Cursing, he adjusted the attitude and tried to keep the skiff pointed straight into their midst. The skiff was moving at 20 meters per second now. No more than 30 meters from the wall, they were going to hit it head on. If one of the creatures got in his way, it might take his damned head off, or Murdoch's, or even destroy the cannon. He ground his teeth and hit the thrusters. The skiff slid sideways again, and he put it into a controlled roll at the same time. A bone-jarring vibration shuddered through the skiff's Atmos steel as the skiff's bottom slammed into the wall of creatures. It cut their momentum significantly, but the skiff continued floating out into space. Gunny checked the starboard cam feed and could see a hole through the wall they'd just come through. The pinecone wall had formed a ripple and had begun parting like curtains. Both Murdoch and Went were yelling on the comms, but Gunny didn't even notice. He was too busy flipping the skiff out of the aft section and pointing the bow back into space. The rear cam showed him more of the pine cones detaching from the ship and from one another. They seemed to be following him. Gunny pounded the rear thrusters, and the skiff quickly accelerated. He kept them firing until a fuel reserve warning kicked on, as well as a proximity alert. He looked up in time to see the SV-52 flying in a positive vector directly above the skiff. Talby was providing more cover. Good. Another vibration shuddered through the hull, but his HUD showed no impacts.
Shit! Gunny!
What, Murdoch? The Marine sounded both shocked and terrified at the same time.
I think this thing is getting ready to go off.
His teeth rattled in his skull. Whatever the beacon had started doing, it was getting worse. A HUD alert flashed. The skiff's atmosteel integrity was beginning to give way. If they didn't stop the beacon, the goddamn thing was going to shake them into pieces, and his squad would die long before that happened. Private! Gunny yelled. Went! Eject now!
No!
Went yelled back. That's a fucking order, Marine! Gunny screamed through the mic. A heartbeat later, he watched as their suit beacons went into emergency mode. His HUD showed them as two pulsing red dots behind him. At the speed the skiff was traveling, the Marines would have to use their suit thrusters to slow down unless they wanted to follow him. He hoped like hell neither of them was dumb enough for that. Gunny punched the thrusters again. Fuck the fuel, he said to no one, and kept the pressure on. The thrusters, not designed for a full burn, glowed like miniature stars. The pulsing continued, getting stronger, his stomach and lungs wanting to jump through his chest with each successive energy wave. His HUD flickered twice, and lines of static flitted across the cam image, leaving his vision distorted and incomplete. Before him was the vast emptiness of the Kuiper Belt. He checked the rear cam and just had time to make out a few of the dangerous life forms following him before it went dead. Well, he said, at least it's not the whole fucking horde.
Gunny!
Talby yelled.
Eject now!
His brain felt as though it was turning to jelly, as if it were hopping up and down in his skull like a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum. Talby was still screaming over the comms, but the words came out in unintelligible, gap-filled streams of syllables. The gist, however, was pretty clear. Gunny needed to eject. The next vibration made something snap in his chest, and he suddenly lost vision in his left eye. The image through the cam feed became a wall of static in his right eye, while his left looked at nothing but darkness. His hand hovered over the eject button. Fuck Pluto. As long as he was in the chair, he could fly the skiff out. He could set the beacon on a course to go back the way it came. He could... His body shook with a convulsion. That last pulse had broken something inside him. A rib, or maybe a spleen. Bright pain rose in a fiery column from his feet to his fingers. A tooth exploded in the lower left of his jaw. Gunny slumped forward and his hand hit the eject button. Suddenly, he was out of the skiff, his right eye watching as the craft continued into the black, heading not toward Pluto, but further out into the Kuiper Belt. Fuck, he said. I could've! Just as the cylinder detonated a sun's worth of light into the darkness, he passed out.